From humble beginnings to global domination, this is the story of the British Empire, its rise, its power, and its eventual fall. Chapter 1. England before Empire, pre-1600. The quiet construction of power. Long before the British Empire ruled distant continents, long before red maps and imperial banners, there was only an island, cold, divided, and uncertain of its future. This is where the story truly begins. Not with conquest overseas, but with survival at home. England, for much of its early history, was not a great power. It was invaded more often than it invaded. Romans came and went. Anglo-Saxons settled. Vikings raided. Normans conquered. Each wave left scars, but also lessons about rule, defense, and authority. From these invasions emerged a people deeply aware of vulnerability, and a ruling class obsessed with control. An island shaped by fear and opportunity. England's geography was both a shield and a prison. The surrounding seas offered protection from sudden invasion, yet also cut the island off from the wealth and influence of continental Europe. Over time, the English learned to look outward, to the water itself. The sea became more than a boundary. It became a path. Fishing villages grew into ports. Coastal trade expanded. Ships became tools not only of commerce but of security. Slowly, almost unintentionally, England began to develop a maritime instinct. This instinct would one day carry it across the world. The Norman blueprint of power. In 1066, William of Normandy crossed the Channel and claimed the English crown. His victory did more than change kings. It changed how England was governed. The Normans imposed order. Land was measured, taxes were recorded, power was centralized under the crown, law became standardized, violence was organized and legitimized. For the first time, England functioned as a coherent state. This administrative discipline, the ability to count, tax, command, and punish, would later become one of the empire's most powerful weapons. Before England ruled others, it learned how to rule itself. Empire at home, Wales, Ireland, and the first colonies. England's earliest imperial experiments did not take place overseas. They happened next door. Wales was conquered and absorbed through force and fortification. Castles rose as symbols of domination. English law replaced local custom. Ireland became something else entirely, a laboratory of empire. English rulers seized land, displaced populations, and planted settlers. Rebellion followed repression. Violence bred resentment. Control was never complete. What England practiced in Ireland, confiscation, settlement, cultural suppression, it would later repeat on a global scale. Ireland was not just a neighbor. It was a warning of what empire could become. The end of European dreams. For centuries, English kings dreamed of continental power. That dream died in France. The 100 Years' War drained England of blood and treasure. In the end, the territories were lost. The crown was humiliated. The illusion of a land empire in Europe collapsed. But defeat created clarity. If England could not dominate Europe by land, it would seek power by sea. This was not a retreat. It was a redirection. Merchants, money, and a new vision of power. As nobles lost land and prestige, merchants gained influence. Wool flowed from English fields to foreign markets. Ships carried goods instead of armies. London grew rich and restless. A new idea began to take hold. Power did not only come from kings and castles. It came from trade. Money could move faster than armies. Ships could reach farther than borders. Profit could achieve what conquest could not. The future empire would not belong to warriors alone. It would belong to investors. The Tudor transformation. The Tudors understood this shift. Henry VII stabilized the kingdom after civil war. He encouraged trade, shipbuilding, and exploration. Henry VIII built something unprecedented, a permanent navy. For the first time, England possessed ships designed not for transport but for war. Dockyards were expanded. Naval officers were trained. The sea became militarized. Under Elizabeth I, this naval power found purpose. England challenged Spain, not directly at first but through speed, maneuver, and daring. Religion, rivalry, and justification. The break from the Catholic Church reshaped England's identity. No longer bound to Rome, England stood opposed to the great Catholic empires of Spain and Portugal. Conflict was inevitable. Religion offered moral cover. War became righteous. Rivalry became destiny. Expansion became duty. Later, empire would be justified as a mission to civilize and reform. But its roots lay here, in religious division and geopolitical fear. Pirates of the Crown. Before England had colonies, it had pirates. Men like Francis Drake sailed with royal approval to raid Spanish ships and settlements. Gold was stolen, ports were burned, intelligence was gathered. These were not criminals. They were imperial apprentices. Through piracy, England learned naval warfare, global navigation, and economic sabotage. It learned how to fight an empire before it became one. The Armada and the moment of belief. In 1588, Spain sent its Great Armada to crush England. It failed. Storms scattered the fleet. English ships harassed it relentlessly. Spain retreated, stunned. England did not suddenly become dominant, but something far more important happened. England believed it could be. Confidence replaced caution. Possibility replaced fear. The ocean no longer belonged to others. A nation ready, but not yet ruling. By the end of the 16th century, England stood prepared. It had a centralized state, a growing navy, experienced sailors, wealthy merchants, ideological rivals, and an appetite for risk. It did not yet have an empire, but it had everything required to build one. And in the year 1600, that process would begin, not with armies but with a company. Chapter 2. The Birth of Overseas Expansion, 1600–1660. Merchants, settlers, and the first reach of empire. At the turn of the 17th century, England stood at the edge of the known world, not because it had reached the limits of geography, but because it had reached the limits of its patience. For generations, English merchants had watched wealth flow past them. Spices, silk, silver, and sugar enriched Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, while England remained a secondary player, barred from the richest trade routes by stronger empires and older claims. That exclusion bred ambition. England would no longer ask for access. It would create its own. The company that changed history. On the final day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to a group of London merchants. It gave them exclusive rights to trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. This was no ordinary document. The East India Company was granted powers once reserved for states. It could wage war, negotiate treaties, build forts, and govern territory, so long as profit followed. For the first time, empire and corporation became partners. This union of private capital and state authority would define British expansion for centuries. A late arrival in an ancient world. When English ships reached the Indian Ocean, they entered a world already ruled by powerful systems. The Mughal Empire dominated the Indian subcontinent with armies, bureaucracy, and wealth beyond European imagination. Portuguese forts guarded key ports. Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants controlled trade networks that had functioned for centuries. The English were outsiders, poorly armed, poorly informed, and entirely dependent on local permission. They bowed. They bribed. They waited. The empire that would one day command India began on its knees. Factories without factories. The company established factories, not places of manufacture but fortified trading posts. In Surat, Madras, and later Bombay, English traders lived under the authority of local rulers. They paid taxes, accepted restrictions, endured humiliation. Yet they observed carefully. They studied local politics. They recorded rivalries. They learned which alliances could be purchased. Trade was the cover. Knowledge was the weapon. Westward dreams, the New World experiments. While merchants looked east, others sailed west. In 1607, Jamestown was founded on the coast of Virginia. It was not a grand plan but a gamble, poorly supplied, badly governed, and dependent on indigenous goodwill it would soon betray. Disease and hunger killed more settlers than warfare. Cannibalism was recorded. Survival was uncertain. Yet the colony endured. Tobacco changed everything. Once profit appeared, England committed itself fully. Land hunger followed. Indigenous displacement followed that. This was not coexistence. It was replacement. A different kind of colony. English colonies differed from Spanish ones. Spain ruled over conquered peoples. England sought to remove them. Settlers arrived with families, not just soldiers. Land was fenced, forests cleared, societies transplanted. The violence was slower, quieter, but permanent. North America became England's first large-scale experiment in settler colonialism, and the consequences would echo for centuries. Sugar, slavery, and sudden wealth. If North America offered land, the Caribbean offered fortune. In islands like Barbados, sugar plantations transformed England's imperial economy almost overnight. But sugar demanded labor, brutal, constant, expendable labor. The solution was slavery. English ships joined the Atlantic slave trade, transporting millions of Africans in chains. Survival rates were low. Suffering was immense. The profits were extraordinary. Plantations, ports, banks, and shipyards in England all benefited. Empire was no longer theoretical. It was visible in stone, coin, and blood. Violence becomes system. By the mid-17th century, England's overseas presence was no longer experimental. It was structured. Land seizures became policy. Forced labor became normalized. Racial hierarchy hardened into law. Violence was no longer chaotic. It was organized, justified, and profitable. Empire was learning how to sustain itself. Civil war at home, expansion abroad. Between 1642 and 1660, England tore itself apart. King fought Parliament. Armies marched through towns. A king was executed. Yet the empire did not stop. Colonies remained productive. Trade continued. Naval power expanded. Overseas wealth helped finance domestic conflict. Empire proved resilient, even when the state collapsed. Restoration and resolve. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, England emerged changed. It possessed permanent colonies, global trade networks, a powerful navy, experience ruling distant peoples. What began as commerce was becoming control. What began as survival was becoming dominance. Closing reflection. England had crossed a line. It was no longer merely trading with the world. It was reshaping it. The foundations of empire were now laid, not in ideology or ambition alone, but in systems that rewarded expansion and punished restraint. The next phase would bring something darker. Empire would no longer spread quietly. It would spread by force. Chapter 3. Empire and Slavery, 1662–1763. The Age of Profit, Violence, and Global War. By the middle of the 17th century, England's overseas ventures were no longer fragile experiments clinging to survival. They had become something far more deliberate, profitable. What followed was not an age of discovery, but an age of calculation, where land, labor, and lives were measured not in human terms but in yield. This was the moment the British Empire learned how to grow rich. Restoration and expansion. The year 1660 restored the English monarchy, but it did not restore an older world. The empire that emerged afterward was more aggressive, more commercial, and more ruthless than anything that had come before. The crown now understood that overseas possessions were not luxuries. They were engines of power. Chartered companies multiplied, colonies expanded, laws were rewritten to favor merchants, shipowners, and plantation elites. Empire had become policy, the machinery of the slave trade. At the heart of this expansion lay a system designed for maximum extraction. The triangular trade connected 3 continents. Manufactured goods from England, enslaved Africans from West Africa, sugar, tobacco, and cotton from the Americas. Each leg of the journey generated profit. Each relied on violence. English ships carried iron, guns, and cloth to African ports. There, human beings were purchased, branded, and forced aboard vessels designed to maximize cargo, human cargo. The Middle Passage was a journey of disease, starvation, and terror. Many did not survive it. Those who did were sold, broken, and worked to death. This was not an accident of empire. It was its foundation. Slavery becomes law. By the late 17th century, slavery was no longer informal or improvised. It was legalized. Colonial governments created racial codes defining enslaved Africans as property. Children inherited bondage. Violence became a legal right of ownership. Skin color hardened into destiny. These laws did not merely permit cruelty, they required it. Entire societies were built upon the assumption that some lives existed solely to enrich others. The sugar kingdoms. Nowhere was this system more visible than in the Caribbean. Islands like Jamaica and Barbados became sugar factories, worked relentlessly by enslaved labor. Life expectancy for enslaved people was brutally short. Plantation owners grew wealthy beyond measure. London bankers financed expansion. Insurance companies insured slave ships. The British economy began to orbit around exploitation. Sugar sweetened British tea, but it was paid for in blood. North America's expanding shadow. In North America, slavery spread alongside settlement. Plantations dominated the southern colonies. Indigenous peoples were pushed westward or destroyed. African labor became essential to colonial growth. Meanwhile, English settlers increasingly viewed themselves not as subjects of the crown, but as partners in empire, entitled to land, autonomy, and profit. The seeds of future rebellion were already present. The empire goes to war. As Britain's empire grew, so did its enemies. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were marked by near-constant warfare against the Dutch, the French, and Spain. These wars were not only European, they were global. Battles were fought in the Caribbean, North America, India, the high seas. Naval power became decisive. The Royal Navy expanded relentlessly, protecting trade routes and strangling rival empires. War became a tool of economic domination. India enters the imperial orbit. While slavery powered Atlantic expansion, India became the focus of Eastern ambition. The Mughal Empire remained dominant, but cracks were forming. Regional rulers competed. Authority fragmented. The East India Company exploited these divisions. At first it was only trade, then influence, then intervention. British troops fought not as conquerors but as allies, for sale to the highest bidder. Control came quietly. Violence as routine. By the early 18th century, violence was no longer extraordinary. It was administrative. Rebellions were crushed. Communities were destroyed. Markets were forced open. Laws were imposed by gunfire. Empire did not apologize. It justified. Civilization, progress, and order became the language of domination. The 7 Years' War, Empire decided. Between 1756 and 1763, Britain fought what many consider the first true world war. The 7 Years' War was fought across continents and oceans. Its outcome would decide global dominance. Britain emerged victorious. France lost much of its empire. Britain gained Canada, dominance in India, and naval supremacy unmatched by any rival. By 1763, Britain stood as the world's leading imperial power. The transformation was complete. Closing reflection. The British Empire did not rise through chance. It rose through systems, systems that turned suffering into profit and war into policy. Slavery was not a dark chapter in an otherwise noble story. It was the story. By 1763, Britain ruled not because it was moral or enlightened, but because it had learned how to organize violence at a global scale. The empire had reached its peak of confidence. What it had not yet learned was restraint. Chapter 4. Loss and Reinvention, 1763 to 1783. When empire stumbled and learned to adapt. By 1763, Britain stood at the pinnacle of global power. Its navy ruled the seas. Its merchants controlled trade from India to the Caribbean. Its soldiers held territory across continents. Victory in the 7 Years' War had seemed absolute. And yet, empire is never permanent. Within a generation, Britain would confront a shock unlike any before. It would learn that domination abroad was fragile, and that wealth and power could vanish faster than armies could march. The first great crisis came not from distant rivals, but from its own colonies. America breaks away. The 13 colonies in North America had grown restive for decades. Initially loyal, they had prospered under British rule. Trade had flourished. Local governance had developed. Life, in many ways, had been relatively self-contained. Yet over time, tensions grew. The Crown's insistence on taxes, trade restrictions, and centralized control began to feel oppressive. The colonies had become economically capable and politically conscious. They resented a distant government dictating terms without their consent. When Britain imposed the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and other levies, it ignited rebellion. Arguments over representation, liberty, and governance erupted into conflict. By 1775, war had begun. The American Revolution. The Revolution was a profound shock to British confidence. The empire that had defeated France and dominated the seas now struggled against a collection of colonies. British generals were experienced. British soldiers were disciplined. British strategy had succeeded on every other continent, and yet in North America they faltered. Several factors combined against Britain. Distance. Reinforcements took months to arrive. Supply lines were stretched across the Atlantic. Terrain. Colonists knew the land, forests, and rivers better than the invaders. Alliances. France, Spain, and the Dutch provided critical support to the Americans. Ideology. The revolutionaries fought not only for territory, but for a vision of self-rule. By 1781, British forces surrendered at Yorktown. The loss of the 13 colonies was more than a territorial defeat. It was a psychological one. The empire, once seemingly unstoppable, had faltered. Economic consequences. The American Revolution strained Britain's economy. The cost of war had been immense. Debt soared, trade patterns were disrupted. The mercantile system, which had fueled centuries of expansion, needed urgent recalibration. Yet paradoxically, the loss also created opportunity. Britain's remaining colonies were now more valuable, more dependent, and more tightly controlled. Lessons learned in North America would guide policy in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Political consequences. Politically, the loss triggered introspection. Parliament debated reform. Leaders reconsidered taxation, representation, and colonial administration. New systems emerged. Increased oversight of colonies. Stronger military presence overseas. Professionalized bureaucracies to administer distant lands. Britain realized that empire could not rely solely on inherited rights or military might. Administration, logistics, and local knowledge had to be mastered. Reinventing the empire. By the late 1780s, Britain had begun to reinvent itself. The empire shifted focus from North America to India, the Caribbean, and Africa. India became the centerpiece of imperial ambition, with the East India Company acting as both trader and ruler. Caribbean sugar plantations, reliant on enslaved labor, continued to fund imperial expansion. West African trade, though morally reprehensible, remained a critical source of capital. Britain learned to adapt. Loss in one region did not mean the collapse of all. Empire had become flexible, resilient, and ruthless in its pragmatism. Lessons of the crisis. The American Revolution taught Britain several lessons that would shape the empire for the next century. Distance is a vulnerability. Control requires local structures and rapid communication. Ideology matters. Colonies are not passive. They have identity, expectation, and agency. Adaptation is essential. Empire must change strategies when failure occurs. Commerce drives empire. Profit motivates loyalty as much as ideology or law. From the ashes of loss, Britain emerged stronger, but smarter. The empire would not overreach again so recklessly, at least for a time. Closing reflection. The fall of the 13 colonies was a warning, a lesson, and a turning point. It demonstrated that even the most powerful empire could stumble. And yet it also revealed a remarkable truth. The British Empire did not collapse under failure. It learned from it. This ability to adapt, reorganize, and refocus would become the hallmark of Britain's imperial strategy, allowing it to dominate India, Africa, and Asia in the century to come. The age of American loss was not the end of empire. It was the beginning of the empire that would reach its greatest heights. Chapter 5. India becomes the empire's core, 1757 to 1857. From traders to rulers, the East India Company and the making of an empire. The year 1757 marked a turning point not only for India, but for the British Empire as a whole. It was the year that a single battle would alter the course of global history, the Battle of Plassey. On the banks of the Hooghly River, Robert Clive and a relatively small force of British soldiers and sepoys defeated the army of Suraj ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal. Victory came not through sheer numbers, but through cunning, bribery, and local alliances. The British East India Company emerged from the battle not merely as traders, but as rulers. From that moment, India was no longer just a destination for commerce. It became the jewel of the empire, the source of wealth, power, and prestige. The East India Company, from merchant to state. Before Plassey, the East India Company had been a trading organization, reliant on permission from Indian rulers. After Plassey, it became something else entirely, a sovereign power with armies, bureaucracies, and tax authority. The transformation was extraordinary. Company officials became governors, soldiers enforced law, taxes flowed from villages to Calcutta, then to London. Trade and governance became inseparable. India became the empire's laboratory. Policies developed there, land systems, revenue collection, military organization, would later define the British approach across the globe. Economic exploitation and the land system. Central to British control was the extraction of wealth. In Bengal, the permanent settlement of land revenue established by the company created a new class of landlords, loyal to British authority. Farmers were heavily taxed. Crops were requisitioned. Traditional systems of agriculture were reshaped to feed markets abroad. Famine and poverty followed. While trade profits soared, millions of Indians suffered under policies designed for efficiency and profit, rather than human need. The British learned a crucial lesson. Wealth could be extracted without political conquest, at least initially, if administration and coercion were applied carefully. Indian resistance and collaboration. Control was never uncontested. India was vast, diverse, and fiercely independent. Local rulers resisted where they could, occasionally rallying armies to challenge company authority. Peasant uprisings, regional wars, and localized rebellions were constant reminders that power required maintenance. At the same time, some Indian elites collaborated, seeing opportunity in alliance with the British. They received titles, privileges, and land, often at the expense of rivals. Empire thrived on these networks of cooperation and coercion, building power incrementally rather than conquering all at once. The expansion of company rule. By the early 19th century, British control extended beyond Bengal to Bombay, Madras, and eventually much of the subcontinent. Wars, treaties, and alliances gradually reduced the authority of local princes. The company's armies, composed of both British and Indian soldiers, enforced policy with efficiency and brutality. Trade remained central, but governance became inseparable. India was no longer a source of goods alone. It was a source of revenue, manpower, and strategic advantage. Cultural and social transformation. British control reshaped India's society as much as its economy. English education was introduced, producing a class of clerks and administrators loyal to the company. Law codes were codified, merging British and Indian legal traditions. Infrastructure, roads, ports, and telegraphs, was developed to serve trade and military purposes. These changes created a dual effect. They facilitated imperial rule, but also sowed the seeds of resistance. A new Indian middle class would later become aware of the contradictions of British justice and profit, fueling nationalist sentiment. The wealth of India fuels empire. The profits from India were staggering. Cotton, spices, textiles, and later tea enriched company shareholders. Revenue collected from land taxes financed military campaigns, colonial administration, and trade elsewhere. India became the financial backbone of the British Empire. Success here allowed Britain to sustain wars in Europe, expand influence in Africa, and dominate global trade networks. The empire's lessons in India. India taught the British three critical lessons. Administration is as powerful as force. Control depends on bureaucracy, law, and taxation. Profit drives policy. Economic gain guides military and political action more than ideology. Resistance is inevitable. Power must be maintained constantly, through alliances, coercion, and surveillance. Plassey was more than a battle. It was the blueprint for empire. Closing reflection. By the mid-19th century, India was not merely a possession. It was the center of the empire, the heart from which wealth, influence, and strategy radiated outward. Control of India would define British foreign policy, shape the Royal Navy, and fuel ambitions across Asia and Africa. And yet beneath the wealth and order, tension simmered. Inequality, resentment, and cultural disruption were building toward a crisis yet to come. Empire, as always, was both power and peril. Chapter 6. Industrial Revolution and Empire, 1782–1850. When machines made Britain mighty. By the late 18th century, Britain had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The empire that had once relied on ships, trade, and a handful of soldiers now drew its strength from machines, coal, and iron. The Industrial Revolution was not merely an economic change. It was a social upheaval, a technological leap, and a strategic advantage. And it reshaped the empire in profound ways. Machines, factories, and power. Steam engines roared in factories. Cotton mills hummed with relentless energy. Ironworks produced rails, cannons, and ships at speeds impossible just decades earlier. Britain became the workshop of the world, producing goods faster, cheaper, and in greater quantity than any competitor. These goods were not only sold at home, they were exported across continents, flooding markets in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Industrial power became imperial power. The ability to produce, transport, and sell on a global scale meant that Britain could dominate trade and influence nations far beyond its shores. Raw materials and colonial dependency. Factories demanded raw materials, cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, timber from North America. Colonies became vital suppliers, feeding the engines of industry. At the same time, colonies became captive markets for British goods. Textiles, machinery, and manufactured products flowed outward, creating a cycle of dependency. Empire was no longer just about conquest. It was about supply chains, production, and consumption on a global scale. Railways, steamships, and telegraphs. Technology reshaped movement and communication. Railways connected mines, factories, and ports. Steamships shortened travel across oceans and rivers. Telegraphs allowed messages to travel at unprecedented speeds, linking London to Calcutta, Singapore, and Cape Town. The empire was shrinking, not in territory, but in the time it took to manage it. Britain could now project power quickly, respond to rebellions, and coordinate trade on a scale previously unimaginable. Military-industrial supremacy. Industrialization also transformed warfare. Cannons were stronger, rifles were more accurate, ships of the line could be built faster and maintained more efficiently. Britain's military advantage was no longer based solely on skill or experience. It was mechanical, systematic, and enduring. Empire could now expand and maintain itself using both human and technological resources, reinforcing control over distant territories. India and industrial integration. India, already central to the empire, became increasingly tied to Britain's industrial economy. Cotton from India fed textile mills in Manchester and Liverpool. Railways and ports were built to transport goods efficiently. British administration encouraged monoculture and export-oriented agriculture. Local economies were reshaped to serve industrial Britain, often at the expense of subsistence farming and traditional livelihoods. The Industrial Revolution made India a machine in the imperial network, both source of wealth and stage for British technological power. Trade, finance, and global reach. Industrial wealth fueled a sophisticated global trade network. Banks financed overseas expansion. Insurance companies protected ships. Stock markets invested in colonies, railways, and factories. Empire became a financial as well as a military and political enterprise. Success was measured not only in territory but in pounds, shillings, and pence flowing into London. Social consequences in Britain. Industrial growth was not evenly distributed. Cities swelled as workers flocked to factories. Living conditions were harsh. Pollution, disease, and overcrowding were rampant. Yet these social challenges did not stop empire. In fact, industrial Britain used the colony as both resource supplier and market, reinforcing domestic growth and imperial ambition simultaneously. The empire expands its reach. During this period, Britain expanded influence across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Industrial superiority allowed Britain to dominate trade routes, secure new territories, and outpace rivals like France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Control was increasingly systematic and technological, combining diplomacy, local alliances, and the latest machinery. Empire was no longer just about soldiers or settlers. It was about integrating territory, people, and resources into a single global system. Closing reflection. By 1850, the British Empire had become more than a collection of colonies. It was a global network powered by steam, steel, and finance. Industrial might allowed it to dominate oceans, markets, and peoples with unprecedented efficiency. The foundations of power had shifted. No longer dependent solely on local armies or mercantile skill, Britain now commanded a mechanized, interconnected, and remarkably resilient empire. Yet with all this power came new challenges: resistance, rebellion, and the moral questions that industrialized exploitation would increasingly raise. The next chapter will explore the Royal Navy, the linchpin of Britain's global supremacy, and how control of the seas ensured the empire's dominance for generations. Chapter 7. The British Empire at Sea. How the oceans made an empire. To understand the British Empire at its height, one must understand the sea. Not just as a barrier, not merely as a route for trade, but as the very stage upon which Britain projected power across the globe. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Royal Navy was no longer a force among many. It was the force. Ships, sailors, and strategy became the lifeblood of empire, enabling Britain to connect continents, dominate trade, and enforce authority in ways no land army could. The empire's strength was maritime. Its reach depended upon ships, winds, and tides. From coastal defense to global dominance, early English navies were designed to defend the home islands from invasion, against the Spanish Armada, against French fleets, against pirates and raiders. But over time, defense gave way to projection of power. English ships sailed beyond the Channel, across the Atlantic, and around Africa to India. The Navy became not merely a shield but a sword. Control of the seas allowed Britain to protect merchant shipping, transport troops efficiently, block rivals from trade, punish rebellion swiftly. No empire in history had relied so heavily on naval power, yet none would come close to Britain's scale or efficiency. Training, discipline, and innovation. The Royal Navy was not powerful by accident. Sailors were trained rigorously. Officers were educated in navigation, gunnery, and command. Discipline was harsh but effective. Ships evolved constantly. The design of frigates, battleships, and later steam-powered vessels reflected both technology and strategy. Naval architecture, artillery, and logistics were refined with relentless attention to detail. By the early 19th century, British sailors could outfight, outmaneuver, and outlast any competitor on the seas. Naval supremacy was absolute. Trade routes and strategic choke points. Empire depended on trade, and trade depended on control of the oceans. Britain secured critical choke points. The Strait of Gibraltar, gateway to the Mediterranean. The Cape of Good Hope, linking Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Key ports in India, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. Holding these points allowed Britain to monitor commerce, enforce tariffs, and prevent rival empires from expanding. The seas themselves became a network of surveillance and control. Naval warfare as empire policy. Naval power was more than defense, it was policy in action. Blockades were imposed on France during the Napoleonic Wars. Pirate strongholds were destroyed in the Caribbean. Colonial uprisings were crushed before they spread. The Navy also protected the vast fleets of merchant ships carrying raw materials to England and manufactured goods back to colonies. Without this maritime umbrella, the empire's economic engine could not operate. Technology and the industrial age at sea. By the mid-1800s, industrialization transformed the Navy. Steam engines allowed ships to sail independently of wind patterns. Ironclads replaced wooden ships, making fleets more durable. Advanced artillery extended range and firepower. Britain's industrial advantage at home became a naval advantage abroad, ensuring control of global trade and power projection unmatched by any rival. The Navy as cultural symbol. The Royal Navy was more than ships and sailors. It was a symbol of national identity. It represented Britain's reach and strength. It instilled confidence at home. It struck fear abroad. Sailors and officers were celebrated in literature, art, and popular imagination. The Navy was both practical and ideological, the embodiment of Britain's ability to rule the waves. Securing empire through the sea. The combination of merchant networks, industrial power, and naval supremacy allowed Britain to maintain an empire that was geographically scattered, yet centrally controlled. From India to the Caribbean, Africa to Southeast Asia, the Navy ensured that distance was no barrier. Rebellion could be suppressed, trade could flow, power could be projected instantly across thousands of miles. Without the Royal Navy, the empire could not have existed in the form history remembers. Closing reflection. The oceans made Britain. The Royal Navy allowed the empire to expand, consolidate, and endure. Its dominance over the seas shaped global commerce, politics, and warfare. By 1850, Britain ruled a world interconnected by water, trade, and steel. Ships carried not just goods, but authority, ideology, and the reach of empire. The next chapter will explore Victorian imperialism, when Britain transformed this maritime and industrial power into a global cultural, political, and ideological force. Chapter 8. Victorian Imperialism, 1837–1901. The Empire at its height. The reign of Queen Victoria, beginning in 1837, ushered in an era of unprecedented expansion, influence, and confidence. The British Empire was no longer just a collection of colonies and trading posts. It had become a global network of commerce, culture, and power, stretching from the icy waters of Canada to the deserts of Africa, and from the jungles of India to the distant shores of Australia. Victorian imperialism was both deliberate and deliberate in its presentation. It was an empire not only of soldiers and merchants, but of ideology, of belief, and of pride. The jewel in the crown, India. India remained the centerpiece of the empire. Following the formal establishment of the British Raj in 1858, after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown assumed direct control from the East India Company. The rebellion had been a warning. Resistance could flare violently and unexpectedly, yet the British adapted. They restructured the administration, professionalized the army, and tightened oversight over local rulers. India was now administered as a colony, but with systems designed to extract wealth efficiently, maintain order, and integrate the region into global trade. Railways, telegraphs, ports, and canals linked Indian cities to the global economy and to London. The Crown's control over India symbolized Britain's capacity to govern vast populations at a distance, and its ability to combine military power with economic and bureaucratic dominance. Africa and the scramble for influence. In Africa, British imperialism took both formal and informal forms. Coastal forts and trading posts evolved into territorial claims, often justified through treaties, protectorates, and spheres of influence. The mid to late 19th century saw increasing European competition. Britain's industrial and naval power allowed it to secure valuable resources, control strategic ports, and expand influence without necessarily conquering every inland territory immediately. Africa became a theater of strategic planning, diplomacy, and, often, ruthless exploitation. Trade, human labor, and natural resources fed Britain's global economy, and imperial control extended wherever British guns and bureaucrats could reach. Colonies in the Pacific and the Caribbean. Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands were integrated into the empire primarily as settler colonies. British settlers imposed European legal, social, and cultural systems. Indigenous populations were marginalized, displaced, or decimated. In the Caribbean, sugar, coffee, and other commodities continued to fuel the imperial economy, even after the abolition of slavery in the 1830s. Indentured labor from India and China replaced enslaved Africans, ensuring continuity of production and profit. The empire had become adaptable, capable of replacing one system of labor with another to maintain economic dominance. Ideology and the civilizing mission. Victorian imperialism was as much about ideas as it was about guns and money. The notion of a civilizing mission pervaded discourse in Britain. Empire was presented as a moral duty, a benevolent force for education, religion, and governance, a vehicle for progress, science, and law. Schools, churches, hospitals, and railways were part of this mission. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay exploitation, coercion, and hierarchical control. Ideology justified what force could not, masking profit and domination as duty. Industrial power meets global reach. Britain's Industrial Revolution amplified Victorian imperialism. Steamships connected continents, railways opened territories, and telegraphs allowed near-instant communication between colony and metropolis. Trade flourished. Manufactured goods flooded colonial markets, while raw materials and cash crops enriched the metropole. Industrialization allowed the empire to expand and maintain itself efficiently, transforming global economies and reshaping societies under British influence. Cultural projection and national identity. Victorian Britain took pride in its empire. Literature, art, newspapers, and exhibitions celebrated imperial achievement. The empire became a central part of national identity, instilling a sense of moral, cultural, and technological superiority. Education and propaganda in Britain reinforced the idea that global dominance was a natural extension of national character. Empire was presented as both achievement and destiny, blending confidence with hubris. Resistance and rebellion. Even at its height, the empire faced resistance. India had the 1857 rebellion. African kingdoms resisted encroachment. Indigenous populations in Australia and the Pacific resisted dispossession. Britain's response combined military might with political strategy, ensuring rebellion was contained, while using the lessons learned to tighten control across the empire. Closing reflection. By the end of the Victorian era, Britain had created a global empire unlike any in history. It combined industrial strength, naval supremacy, bureaucratic efficiency, ideological justification, economic integration. It was vast, resilient, and adaptive, a machine of global power. Yet beneath the splendor and confidence, challenges loomed. Economic competition, nationalist movements, and moral contradictions that would strain the empire in the century to come. The next chapter will explore the late 19th century expansion, diplomacy, and the challenges that set the stage for the 20th century, when empire would both reach its peak and confront its limits. Chapter 9. The Empire at its Zenith and Global Diplomacy, 1872–1900. when Britain ruled the waves and negotiated the world. By the final decades of the 19th century, the British Empire had reached a scale and influence unmatched in human history. From the frozen reaches of Canada to the tropical jungles of India, from the deserts of Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the empire touched every corner of the globe. Its power was no longer solely military or economic. It was administrative, technological, and ideological. Britain not only commanded territories, it shaped the global order, influencing trade, law, and diplomacy. Yet, ruling an empire of such magnitude brought challenges: competition from other powers, rising nationalism, and the logistical strain of maintaining control across continents. Global reach and territorial control. By 1870, Britain's empire included India as the jewel in the crown, administratively integrated and economically vital; Africa with expanding protectorates, colonies, and strategic ports; Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other settler colonies, loyal but increasingly autonomous; the Caribbean, strategically important for trade and commerce; Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands, connected through naval power and commerce. The empire's global presence required careful coordination. Communication networks, telegraphs, and steamships allowed officials in London to exert influence thousands of miles away, while local administrators implemented policy on the ground. Diplomacy as imperial strategy. Empire was maintained not only through force but through negotiation. Britain became a master of diplomacy, balancing power with rivals like France, Germany, Russia, and the United States. Treaties, alliances, and conventions ensured that conflicts could be managed without full-scale war. Control of strategic choke points, the Suez Canal, Gibraltar, the Cape of Good Hope, was negotiated and enforced. Diplomacy and naval supremacy worked hand in hand. Britain could threaten, cajole, and coerce with the implicit knowledge that its fleets dominated the seas. Africa, the scramble intensifies. The late 19th century saw intensified competition for Africa. Britain expanded north from South Africa, west from its coastal possessions, and east along the Nile and Red Sea. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 codified European claims, and Britain secured key territories without direct conflict in many cases. Strategic interests, access to resources, control of trade routes, and protection of Egypt and India dictated the pace and location of expansion. Empire at this stage was increasingly geopolitical, blending military occupation with strategic diplomacy and economic leverage. Economic integration of the empire. Trade remained the lifeblood of imperial power. Industrial Britain relied on raw materials from colonies, cotton, tea, sugar, minerals; markets for manufactured goods; financial networks supporting investment, insurance, and banking. The empire became an interconnected system. Profits from one colony funded military and administrative projects in another. Telegraphs, railways, and steamships ensured that the empire could respond quickly to crises and maintain the flow of commerce. Cultural influence and ideology. Victorian ideology framed the empire as a civilizing mission. British culture, law, education, and religion were exported across the globe. Schools taught English, railways reshaped landscapes, law codes established British norms, missionaries spread Christianity. This cultural projection was deliberate. Britain sought not only to govern, but to shape identity, reinforcing loyalty and justifying domination through narratives of progress, civilization, and moral duty. Challenges and resistance. Despite its dominance, the empire faced persistent resistance. Nationalist movements in India and Africa questioned British authority. Indigenous populations in settler colonies pushed for rights and autonomy. Rival powers challenged Britain's strategic positions and influence. Maintaining control required constant vigilance, adaptation, and occasional military intervention. Empire was neither static nor uncontested. It was a dynamic system under constant negotiation between coercion, consent, and diplomacy. Naval supremacy, the key to global order. The Royal Navy remained the cornerstone of imperial power. Its presence ensured that trade routes were secure, colonies protected, and rivals deterred. Naval innovation, including steam power and modern artillery, allowed Britain to project force globally. Control of the oceans gave the empire flexibility unmatched by any other power, and ensured that Britain could enforce its will without necessarily conquering every territory. Closing reflection. By 1900, the British Empire stood at its zenith. It was a global network of colonies, protectorates, and dominions, a system of trade, governance, and military power, and a cultural force that shaped ideas, language, and law across continents. Yet even at its height, the empire was fragile. Distance, resistance, and the rise of other industrial powers reminded Britain that dominance was never guaranteed. The next chapter will explore the challenges of the 20th century, including war, rising nationalism, and the forces that would slowly erode the empire's global control. Chapter 10. War, Nationalism, and the Early Decline, 1900 to 1945. The empire faces modern challenges. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire was vast, wealthy, and unmatched. Yet the very forces that had allowed it to dominate the globe, industrial might, maritime supremacy, and cultural influence, were now being tested like never before. New powers were rising. Nationalist movements were gaining momentum in colonized lands. Global warfare threatened not only territories, but the very structure of empire itself. The age of unquestioned British supremacy was coming under pressure. The Boer Wars and Lessons in Resistance. The Boer Wars in South Africa, 1880–1881 and 1899–1902, were early warnings. Britain fought to assert control over the mineral-rich regions of the Transvaal and Orange Free State. Victory came at immense cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded. Civilian suffering, including internment camps. International criticism of Britain's methods. The Boers demonstrated that even technologically superior forces could face determined resistance. Guerrilla tactics and local knowledge complicated British strategy. Empire could not rely solely on power. It required patience, adaptability, and sometimes ruthless enforcement. World War I, Global Empire at War. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 drew the empire into a conflict of unprecedented scale. Soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand fought alongside British troops in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The war reshaped the empire in profound ways. Economic strain. Financing global war efforts depleted reserves. Human cost. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed. Political tension. Colonial subjects began questioning British authority. The war also accelerated nationalist sentiment. Colonies that had contributed blood and resources now demanded political recognition and autonomy. Empire could no longer rely on loyalty alone. It would have to negotiate legitimacy. Nationalism in India and Africa. India's nationalist movement gained strength during and after World War I. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress advocated for self-rule, challenging British authority through both political negotiation and civil disobedience. Across Africa, emerging movements began to question colonial exploitation. Local elites, educated in European systems, increasingly resisted the legal and economic structures imposed by Britain. Nationalism was no longer a distant threat. It was a force shaping policy, governance, and the very legitimacy of empire. Interwar period, economic and political pressures. After World War I, Britain faced a transformed global landscape. The cost of war strained the economy. The United States and Japan emerged as industrial competitors. Colonies demanded greater autonomy. Domestic politics debated the sustainability of imperial rule. The interwar period forced Britain to reconsider its approach to empire. Economic dependence on colonies, combined with the rise of nationalist movements, meant that the traditional model of control was increasingly unsustainable. World War II, Empire under siege. World War II further tested Britain's global power. Japanese expansion in Asia threatened colonies like Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong. Nazi Germany challenged Britain's position in Europe and the Atlantic. Empire became a strategic asset, but also a vulnerability. Maintaining control over distant territories while fighting a global war stretched Britain's resources to the limit. Colonial subjects again contributed massively to the war effort, yet expectations of post-war reform grew. Britain could no longer assume obedience. It had to contend with aspirations of independence. The seeds of decline. By 1945, the British Empire had survived 2 world wars, but its foundations were shaken. Economic exhaustion left Britain dependent on allies, particularly the United States. Nationalist movements in India, Africa, and the Middle East were gaining unstoppable momentum. Military overextension revealed the limits of global control. Ideological shifts questioned the morality and necessity of imperial rule. The empire that had once seemed eternal now faced a future of uncertainty. Global dominance was no longer assured. It would require compromise, negotiation, and, ultimately, decolonization. Closing reflection. World War II marked a turning point. Britain had demonstrated remarkable resilience, but the costs of global conflict, combined with the rise of nationalist movements, signaled that the age of unquestioned imperial power was ending. Empire would not collapse overnight, but the seeds of 20th century decline were firmly planted. What remained was a transformation, from direct control to negotiated influence, from unquestioned supremacy to a more complex, contested global presence. The next chapter will explore the end of the British Empire in India and Africa, tracing the final decades of decolonization and the emergence of the modern Commonwealth. Chapter 11. Decolonization and the Modern Commonwealth, 1945 to 1997. From empire to influence. By 1945, the British Empire had endured centuries of expansion, conflict, and administration. It had survived world wars, economic crises, and nationalist movements. Yet the conclusion of the Second World War marked the beginning of a new era, one defined not by conquest, but by withdrawal, negotiation, and transformation. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of the globe was entering a period of managed decline, giving rise to the modern Commonwealth of Nations. The end of empire in India. The most significant turning point came in 1947, with the independence of India and Pakistan. The Indian independence movement, led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had combined decades of political negotiation with civil disobedience. World War II had weakened Britain economically and militarily, making continued control increasingly untenable. Partition brought immense challenges. Massive population displacement. Communal violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. Political and administrative restructuring of 2 new nations. For Britain, India's independence was both a loss and a lesson. Empire was no longer sustainable through force alone. Negotiation, compromise, and acknowledgement of self-determination were now essential. Decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean. The 1950s and 1960s saw rapid decolonization across Africa and the Caribbean. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan colony to gain independence in 1957. Kenya, Nigeria, and Tanzania followed in the 1960s, often after complex negotiations or, in some cases, violent struggle. Caribbean colonies gained independence gradually, often peacefully, creating modern nation-states such as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. Britain's strategy combined gradual withdrawal, political guidance, and constitutional frameworks. While some regions experienced turmoil, most transitions were remarkably orderly, given the empire's previous scale. Economic and strategic challenges. Decolonization coincided with a period of economic strain for Britain. Post-war reconstruction required resources that had once been drawn from colonies. Global trade patterns were shifting, with the United States and Europe dominating manufacturing and finance. Maintaining influence in former colonies required diplomacy, aid programs, and trade agreements rather than direct rule. Empire transformed from territorial control into economic and political influence, emphasizing partnerships over domination. The Commonwealth of Nations. As colonies gained independence, Britain sought to maintain connections through the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth became a voluntary association of independent states, a forum for economic, cultural, and political cooperation, a symbol of shared history, language, and governance traditions. This new form of global influence was a rebranding of empire, allowing Britain to remain significant on the world stage even as formal control ended. Asia, the Middle East, and the Far East. Post-war decolonization extended beyond Africa and the Caribbean. Burma and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, gained independence in 1948. Britain withdrew from Palestine in 1948, leaving behind complex geopolitical legacies. Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong followed unique paths, with Hong Kong remaining under British control until 1997. Each transition reflected local conditions, geopolitical realities, and Britain's evolving approach, less about conquest, more about negotiation and strategic calculation. Cultural and political legacy. Even as formal empire ended, Britain's cultural, political, and legal influence persisted. English language and legal systems endured in many former colonies. Parliamentary institutions and democratic practices were maintained or adapted. Economic and educational ties continued through trade, aid, and scholarship. The British Empire had transformed from a network of dominions to a web of influence, with shared history and cooperation replacing direct authority. Closing reflection. By 1997, with the handover of Hong Kong to China, the British Empire had effectively ended as a territorial entity. Yet its legacy endured. Institutions, laws, language, and global connections remained, embodied in the Commonwealth. The story of the British Empire is a story of adaptation, endurance, and transformation, from small trading ventures to a global superpower, and finally to a voluntary association of nations shaped by shared history rather than coercion. The empire had collapsed in the traditional sense, but it had evolved, leaving a complex legacy that continues to shape the modern world. Chapter 12. The Legacy of the British Empire. Power, culture, and influence in the modern world. The British Empire, once the largest in history, may have formally ended with the independence of its last territories, but its influence endures. Across continents, in law, language, trade, and governance, the legacy of Britain's imperial past is unmistakable. Understanding this legacy requires looking beyond maps and battles. It is a story of institution, culture, and global networks that continue to shape nations and societies today. Political legacy. One of the most visible legacies is political. Many former colonies retained parliamentary systems, legal codes, and governance structures introduced under British rule. Constitutions, bureaucracies, and judiciary frameworks often reflected British influence, creating continuity and stability in governance. The Commonwealth remains a forum where former colonies interact diplomatically, sharing resources, experiences, and international cooperation. While sovereignty is now absolute, the political and institutional architecture of the empire continues to inform decision-making in many nations. Economic legacy. Economically, the empire shaped global trade networks that persist today. Former colonies remain major producers of raw materials that once fueled British industry. Trade routes established during imperial times still underpin shipping and logistics networks. Financial systems, stock exchanges, and banking practices introduced by Britain influenced global economic organization. Even after formal empire ended, economic interdependence ensured that former colonies and Britain remained linked, often benefiting both sides while shaping the global economy. Cultural and linguistic influence. Language and culture are among the most enduring legacies. English became a global lingua franca, facilitating commerce, diplomacy, and international relations. Literature, education, and media transmitted cultural norms and ideas across continents. Sports such as cricket, rugby, and football, legal traditions, and educational curricula all reflect British influence. These cultural elements, while adapted locally, demonstrate the pervasive reach of imperial culture. Social and demographic impact. Migration patterns, whether voluntary or forced, also shaped societies. The movement of people between Britain and colonies created diasporas across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and Oceania. Urban centers, trade hubs, and multicultural societies grew from these migrations, blending local and British traditions. Social hierarchies, class systems, and educational structures often mirrored imperial models, influencing generations. The empire, therefore, left not only institutions, but social structures and identities that continue to shape societies. Technological and infrastructural contributions. The British Empire's emphasis on infrastructure left enduring physical legacies. Railways, ports, canals, and roads were built to connect regions, facilitating trade and administration. Communication networks, including telegraphs and later telephone lines, laid the foundation for modern connectivity. Urban planning, city layouts, and civic architecture reflected imperial design, many surviving into the 21st century. These developments accelerated modernization, even in regions that had been colonized under coercion. The moral and historical debate. The legacy of the British Empire is complex and contested. On one hand, it introduced governance, education, and infrastructure that facilitated modernization. On the other, it relied on exploitation, violence, and inequality, particularly in the slave trade, forced labor systems, and suppression of dissent. Understanding the empire requires grappling with both its achievements and its moral contradictions, recognizing the costs alongside the lasting contributions. Global connections and the modern Commonwealth. The modern Commonwealth is perhaps the most visible expression of Britain's legacy. It represents a network of sovereign states linked by history, culture, and cooperation, rather than coercion. Through education, trade, and diplomacy, the Commonwealth preserves ties that once bound an empire together, demonstrating that influence can survive even after formal power fades. Closing reflection. The British Empire shaped the modern world in ways that are impossible to ignore. From political institutions to global trade, from language to culture, from infrastructure to social systems, the empire left a profound imprint on societies across the globe. Its legacy is a mixture of power and responsibility, innovation and oppression, influence and controversy. As the 21st century unfolds, nations continue to navigate this inheritance, embracing its benefits, reckoning with its costs, and defining new identities in a world once dominated by imperial rule. The story of the British Empire is, ultimately, a story that never truly ends. It is a story written not only in history books, but in the daily lives, institutions, and cultures of billions of people worldwide.